Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really complex and honestly pretty misunderstood topic: how religious organizations are taxed in Japan. It's a system that's full of surprising rules and some seriously blurry lines, touching on everything from ancient traditions to modern business.
So let's start with a very common saying you'll hear in Japan. It kind of means monks get to keep it all, or monks rake it in. The idea is that since offerings don't have a production cost, any money they get is pure profit. It's a little cynical, sure, but it perfectly captures this widespread suspicion that a lot of people have.
So, is there any truth to this stereotype? This idea that religious groups in Japan are just rolling in tax-free cash? Does it come from a real sense of unfairness? Or is the reality way more complicated than just a simple saying? Well, as you're about to see, the answer is definitely not black and white. To really get a handle on this whole issue, we first have to understand the sheer scale of religious organizations in the country. And trust me, the numbers alone are probably going to surprise you. Yeah, just take a look at this. We are talking about a vast number of legally registered religious corporations. As of 2017, the grand total was over 180,000. That's an incredible number of temples, shrines, churches, and other groups operating all across Japan. And if you think that number's big, get a load of this. The number of followers they claim to have is even more staggering. Over 181 million. Yes, you heard me right. It's a massive figure, and it points to a very, very interesting cultural situation. So, how is that even possible, right? This chart really puts it into perspective. The number of reported followers is way bigger than the entire population of Japan. Well, this happens because many people don't see themselves as belonging to just one religion. You might visit a Shinto shrine for New Year's, but also have Buddhist traditions in your family. It just shows how deeply these institutions are woven into the cultural fabric of everyday life. Now, it's easy to look at those numbers and think, hey, that's a lot of potential tax revenue. But before we jump to that conclusion, it's really important to hear the other side of the story, because religious groups have some very compelling arguments against slapping on broad new taxes. Their central message is that a simple tax-it-all approach is just totally misguided. They point out, first of all, that they already pay taxes on any profit-making activities. They also warn that broad new taxes, like on property, could literally bankrupt small historic temples, and that sweeping changes would crush the most vulnerable groups while the big, wealthy ones would be fine. And get this, they even say it could paradoxically give them more political influence. So why are they largely tax-exempt in the first place? It's not just some old tradition that never got updated. Their status is actually based on two core principles that are baked right into Japanese tax law. First things first, under the law, they're classified as public interest corporations. This basically puts them in the same bucket as nonprofits, like schools or social welfare groups. The idea is that their main purpose is to serve the public good, not to make a profit for any owners. And this classification gives us the two main pillars for their tax exemption. The first one is that they provide a public good, things like cultural preservation, that the government would otherwise have to pay for, so in theory, they're saving taxpayer money. The second pillar is a bit more theoretical. Corporate tax is basically seen as a down payment on taxes for shareholders. But religious corporations don't have shareholders, so the logic for that kind of tax just doesn't really apply. Okay, so that all sounds pretty logical. But, and this is a really big but, this is where the whole system gets incredibly confusing. The law has to draw a line between a non-taxable religious activity and a taxable profit-making business. And that line is often very, very blurry and, frankly, a little bit strange. So the law tries to clear this up by listing 34 specific categories of taxable businesses. This list covers pretty much everything you can imagine: sales, rentals, publishing, even things like warehousing. If a religious group's activity fits into one of these boxes, they have to pay taxes on it just like a regular company. But here's a perfect example of how weird it gets. If you buy a little paper fortune at a shrine, that's considered a non-taxable donation. The logic is that the price isn't based on the cost of the paper, it's a religious offering. But if you buy a postcard with a picture of that same shrine on it, that's a taxable sale because it's a standard commercial good. The distinction is subtle. The same weird logic applies to services. Let's say you have a wedding at a shrine. The ceremony itself, the sacred ritual part, is a non-taxable religious act. But everything else around it, renting the reception hall, the catering, the photographer, even renting the wedding dress, all of that is considered a separate, taxable business service. Which brings us to a question that actually went all the way to court and perfectly shows just how bizarre these distinctions can get. What about a funeral for a pet? Is that a sacred religious act, or is it just a business? So a temple was performing memorial services for pets, and the tax office said, hey, that's a taxable business. The whole thing ended up in court, and the court actually agreed with the tax office, but you will not believe their reasoning. They officially classified storing the pet's ashes as a warehouse business and performing the actual ceremony as a contracting business. I am not making this up. So what was the crucial piece of evidence that turned a sacred right into warehousing? A price list. That's it. Because the temple had published a fixed list of prices, the law decided it was no longer a religious act based on donations. That simple price list transformed it into a commercial transaction. A set price makes it business. A voluntary donation makes it religion. So you can see how this gets really messy and how the rulings can feel totally arbitrary. That's why the author of our source material proposes a really radical simplification. What if we just flipped the entire system on its head? The proposal is to change the default from non-taxable with exceptions to taxable with exceptions. So instead of trying to define all the things that are business, you would just assume that any income that results in a profit is taxable. Then you could create a much clearer, much smaller list of purely religious activities that would be exempt. It would get rid of all those confusing gray areas. And you can see how this might actually be a lot fairer. For one thing, it's way simpler. You wouldn't need these bizarre rulings about pet funerals anymore. Plus, a small struggling temple that doesn't actually make a profit wouldn't pay any corporate tax anyway. But the large, wealthy organizations that are running like modern businesses, they'd finally have to contribute their fair share. And that really leaves us with this central question this whole debate boils down to. When we're trying to build a fair tax system, what's more important? Should we prioritize simplicity and economic fairness for everyone, or should we protect the special, sacred, and sometimes really hard to define status of religious activity? There's definitely no easy answer.